Hi everybody, welcome back, glad you could tune in again. So we're still thinking about marriage and about divorce and remarriage, and today I want to consider one practical scenario which is actually really quite common in one form or another in our day. Unfortunately, it's a scenario also in which the laws of this country, as in most Western countries and indeed elsewhere across the world, are at some variance with what Scripture requires. And it's actually addressed in Scripture, although it's often misunderstood, and it's important just to get a few things clear about it. Let me paint the scenario for you, then I'm going to read one of the biblical texts that addresses this, and then explain how this should be applied to our day, and you'll quickly see how, regrettably, our laws are not in keeping with the Scriptures at this point. Consider the scenario in which you have a husband and wife, and let's say the husband just leaves or urges the wife to leave, but one way or another they separate at his initiative, and it is for no good reason. There are no lawful grounds for divorce. I've known situations in which the husband just said, "I don't love you anymore." That's not lawful grounds for divorce. It's lawful grounds for something else, but not divorce. And so in those circumstances, the marriage ends, and he, the one who initiated this separation on the unjust and unprincipled grounds, then files for divorce. Well, what are we to make of this situation? Well, Mark chapter 10 addresses this. And in reading this, it's important to remember that Mark is, or Jesus' words as recorded in Mark and by Mark, taking into consideration the tacit exception found in Matthew's Gospel twice, except for marital unfaithfulness or sexual immorality. But here's what it says, Mark 10, verse 10. The disciples asked him again about this matter, the subject that had been talked about previously, divorce and remarriage and so on. And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." So you see what Jesus is saying there. If these circumstances arise when a divorce takes place, except for in cases of marital unfaithfulness, what's actually going on is the marriage relationship isn't over. And that's highlighted by the fact that if either party then were just to go straight away and marry somebody else or enter some kind of intimate relationship with somebody else, they'd be committing adultery. They'd be breaching the marriage covenant, and it's important to understand why that's the case. Back to our scenario, the husband just leaves and says, well, this is over. Even if he files for divorce and is successful in doing so, and regrettably, and this is one of the points at which the laws of our country are at variance with Scripture's teaching, the laws will say the marriage is over, you're divorced, and you're free to remarry, and it's all fine. But Jesus does not say so. Your marriage is still in effect. You may have reneges on your commitments, but that doesn't mean that the Lord no longer holds you bound to the commitments that you've made. So in those circumstances, husband, let's say, leaves his wife, sues for divorce, he's granted a divorce by the state. We're in this odd position, at least in the first instance, as we contemplate this, where the civil authorities say the marriage is over, the living God says, no, it isn't. Now, this is the point at which the confusion arises, because people very frequently fail to take the next step and consider what's actually going to happen next in this situation. The husband who left has no lawful grounds for divorce. And so at that point, if he sues for divorce immediately, and in the first century you could give his wife a certificate of divorce immediately, that's the image in the situation in view here. If he does that, and I realise in many jurisdictions you do have to wait for a certain amount of time, but let's assume he were to do that, he's still bound to his wife and has no lawful grounds for divorcing her. But as that situation persists, his wife now has grounds for divorcing him. And this is the situation that Jesus doesn't go on to elaborate on here. It would have been obvious in the first century. But consider our situation. The husband walks away. Maybe he's granted divorce, maybe he's not. And the divorce papers say that he filed for them and he's been granted them. And in many situations, it will be called a no-fault divorce, as if nobody's at fault for breaking this relationship. Nothing bad has happened, when in fact, he's broken the relationship. But then the wife can sue for divorce legitimately and biblically on the simple grounds of desertion. He's walked away from his covenant commitments. He says he wants a divorce and Jesus says no. But she says she now needs a divorce in order to protect herself and restart her life and so on. And Jesus says yes. To put it more simply, the party at fault for walking away does not have grounds for divorce, even though the state may say that he does. But the wife who's left behind, often in many cases with the children, may then sue for divorce in the eyes of Jesus Christ and be granted it. So we'd be left now in this confusing situation where actually, after a period of time has elapsed and it's become obvious this relationship can't be restored, the man has wandered off, he's permanently gone, it seems, the divorce papers are now telling the truth, at least insofar as they say that the relationship is over. The relationship isn't over for the reason that the divorce papers say, that the man filed for divorce and was granted it. The divorce papers ought to say that he was at fault and the woman was suing for divorce on the grounds of desertion. But, so to speak, the end state is that she is now free to marry again if she wishes to, because she has legitimate grounds for divorce. And now this raises another couple of points. You remember when I spoke about this when I was speaking on the book of James, I said there may be situations in which there's some clearing up needs to be done. Well, if that man became a Christian and then approached me or Pastor Neil or any minister who was trying to follow the scriptural teaching on this matter and asked to marry again, there would be some clearing up to be done. He has some repenting to be done in relation to his previous relationship. Not necessarily that he should go back and remarry his former spouse, but he minimally needs to go and make it right with her in whatever way he can, which might be financial provision for the family. It would certainly be some kind of public apology mirroring the public commitment that he'd broken in marriage. And there's something else, and it comes to this matter of financial provision. When that man walks away from his marriage, he does not thereby become no longer bound by all the commitments that he has previously made, at least not in the eyes of God. So what the divorce papers ought to say, which they don't say in this scenario, but what they ought to say is not only that he's at fault, but that he's required to continue to make the kind of financial provision for his former wife, whom he's walked away from, that he was making for her when they were still married. You can see the implications of that for our law, and again why our laws are often so far at variance with the Bible's teaching. Often men who walk away from marriages remain in high-paying careers and they end up paying a fairly small amount of financial compensation to their wives and children compared to what they're able to pay. The laws of the land enforce those kind of minimal requirements. Well, actually, acting in that behaviour ought to be financially ruinous for the unfaithful man. Because if the courts operated according to biblical principles, what they say is, firstly, well, you have walked away from your commitment to this woman, so she may legitimately divorce you. But at that point, you don't become not bound by the commitments you made to her. Those commitments still stand, and you're required to fulfill them, which would include providing financially for her. You can readily see then how if these ways of life were enforced by the laws of our land, divorce would be a lot less common. Perhaps some marriages might not take place in the first place because people wouldn't enter into them so thoughtlessly and carelessly. But certainly people will be far more mindful of the commitments that they've actually made before God and before the whole society. Promises ought to mean something, and if these biblical standards were upheld, they would mean something. So I hope that's helpful in navigating some of the complexities of that particular kind of situation, which, as I said, is regrettably quite common. It's quite widely misunderstood by Christians who see the first half, so to speak, but not what should follow afterwards. And it is sadly an area in which people will continue to suffer at the hands of spouses who walk away because the laws of our country do not uphold biblical standards at this point. The Lord bless you. Bye for now.